Huge disclaimer before we begin. The video is mostly my subjective opinion regarding game designs of the game mentioned and discussed. While there are certain talking points that I'll not go too in-depth about for the sake of retaining focus, I welcome any comments that like to add anything that I should have skipped or missed, and further discussion is extremely welcome. With that being said, I hope this video is helpful or enjoyable to you. If you have ever played a card game before and are remotely interested in deck building or the metagame, you might have heard of the holy trifecta of deck archetype: aggro, midrange, and control. Well, technically I guess there's also combo, but that's a can of worms that I'll not open for the sake of simplicity. First devised by the MTG community, these definitions have wormed their way into the design space of almost every card game you might be playing. Hell, it has even entered other strategy games. Or did this term originate from other strategy games? Well, I'm not gonna go down that hole. Anyway, these definitions exist for a good reason. They are really good at painting a picture of your objective in a game. Control plays a game of attrition, rendering the opponent's advance useless until they can win from the sheer value of their card. Aggro is trying to end a game quickly, and thus is often a good counter to control as you try to overwhelm the control player's answers. Midrange is just as its name implies. The middle of the game is where the deck is at its strongest, and this deck's gameplays adapt as per their matchup, slowing down in the early game to choke aggro, and to try and burst down control before they hit their power spike in the end game. However, when you try to apply this concept to Yu-Gi-Oh!, well, sometimes, just sometimes, these labels just do not feel right. I think aggro and control are actually pretty easy to tell in Yu-Gi-Oh! Aggro now flushes the board with a crazy amount of negation to close out the game as soon as the opponent starts playing, or being able to play through the opponent's gameplay to beat down going second. Control should be easy to tell from the way they amass resource and normally do not have a clean way to close out games. With that being said, let's take Kashtira.
It's a card that's banished face down. You use the start to lock a spell and trap cards down. It's your mode in their deck maybe, but unlikely since you need your normal summon. But yeah, he's going to need some sort of monster to deal with. Yeah, this is where the decision comes where you want to play cards in your hand that you can use on your opponent's turn. Something like Nibiru the Primal Being.
7 zones he can't use.
No, it's about to be 9, I think. I want to see them all. This was on my checklist to see all the zones get locked out. He's close. Bang, bang. 9 zones locked out. He has one extra monster zone remaining. Are you going to concede?
I won game 1. I think that's game. I won game 1.
One zone short of seeing them.
It is properly appropriate to assess a deck by looking at its end board going first. So, I think it's fair to say that at its basic level, Kashtira prefers to end around 1 Sangri Era and 1 Arise Heart. That, if not negated, amounts roughly to 1 Macrocosmos, one other Kashtira name for the deck, which with Arise Heart will make 2 Disruption and 3 really large bodies. 2 Disruption, especially as on-board banish, is actually not a big deal in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! We're not gonna discuss how the Macrocosmos affect, so for the sake of simplifying, let's say you're prepared with a non-engine for it. This is quite a fragile board, yet one that Kashtira can afford to build back easily. So does it put them as a mid-range deck? But see, if you have played versus Master Duel Kashtira, you might have observed an interesting phenomenon. Some players will opt to go second with the deck, boarding a high number of removal, and try to beat down the opponent for the high stats of the main deck Kashtira names. So why is it an aggro deck all of a sudden now? Or in a different veins, let's take a look at Salamangreat. Not a modern version of the deck after its support in Duelists of Explosion and the Water Century Duelist box in the OCG. Not the deck's original inception during the TOS format either. I'm thinking of the period when the Code Talker He So came out, where Salamangreat was in more of a rogue status, but its competence is not the main talking point. He So's draw power, combined with the original Salamangreat resource loop from Sunlight Wolf, turns Salamangreat into a full-fledged control deck with an insane resource game. On paper. You see, it does all that. It really does all that. Like a control deck would. But, well, I'll let the footage speak for itself. Yeah, if 7 grades successfully make it through the opponent's turn, they will often try to get to access code on the remaining resource and end the game on turn 3. Hell, if the board state is preferable and the deck has to go second, making access codes is more often the deck's win condition than trying to control the game in a slow burn. What happened to gathering resource? What happened to not having an easy way to close out games? What kind of control deck wins in 3 or 2 turns? I'm not making these examples to say that these two decks are unfair. Well, maybe Castier-ish, but it's still a glass cannon with an embracing consistency with the amount of hits it has gotten over time. But 7 Great is, with that version of the deck, at that point in time, is probably as fair as this game ever gets. And the narrative I paint here is, admittedly, hyperbole. His social Great isn't likely to be always able to make access code against competent decks, and lose to aggro decks with crazy disruption or resilience, as it should. But these two examples aim to portray how certain decks designed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not really conform to other card game standards. Or does it? Maybe we should take a step back to, well, not exactly the beginning point. I did my best but couldn't find a way to pinpoint where deck classification originated. So we'll arrive at an earlier point in time where I think the concept has begun to take form, and this article takes quite an interesting spin on it. Who's the Beatdown? By Mike Flores, 1999, initially posted on the Dojo, one of the oldest Magic the Gathering websites, known for curated discussion posts and meticulous metagame reports, and is probably one of the oldest competitive card games resource sites. But let's talk about the actual article. Since the article itself is filled to the brim with actual examples from a game of Magic, I won't be able to read the article to you word for word. So here's an attempt at an abstract. Can my job ever get easier? In a nutshell, Mike Flores assumed that in a game there will always be two roles, the aggressor and the defender, even in matchup with the same deck archetypes. This is because despite sharing the same monikers, one deck will inadvertently be built with more or less tools than the others, whether said tools are offensive or defensive. Once you exhaust yourself of either type of resource, you have effectively cut yourself short of the ability to attack or defend. Therefore, it's vital to either run your opponent out of said resource and take the win from there, or raise your opponent until you can't. That's a lot of words, so in Mike's own terms. A similar deck versus similar deck matchups, there are a couple of things that you want to look at to figure out what role to play. 1. Who has more damage? Usually he has to be the Beatdown deck. 2. Who has more removal? Usually he has to be the control deck. 3. Who has more permission and card drawing? Almost always he has to be the control deck. Now, permission isn't the clearest word, but I assume it means the option allowed in a game. But we can do even better than this. Patrick Hoban, one of the greatest Yu-Gi-Oh! Players to have ever lived, has also written a Yu-Gi-Oh! Version of this article in his book, Road with the King, in which he established a checklist to determine roles within the game. Since the game Yu-Gi-Oh! Has changed so much and some of these points has become obsolete, I'll trim out certain points. Which deck has a higher turn ceiling? This deck is the control. Which deck has a higher game ceiling? This deck is the control. Which deck has more defensive cards? You guessed it. This deck is the Beatdown. Wait, defensive cards for the Beatdown? That practically goes against every other common sense for other card games. Well, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just built different, I guess. Normally, we use defensive cards to address removals. Other type of defensive card exists, but removal is the most straightforward. So, if you're someone that plays Yu-Gi-Oh! Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Watching this, let me ask you a question. What type of decks in our game plays the most amount of removals or board breakers? Patrick Hoban was a visionary. While defensive cards in his time were mainly powerful traps that focus on disrupting the opponent's game plan, which can be too slow for the modern game, he did get something right. The Beatdown in Yu-Gi-Oh! Loves blowout options to disrupt the opponent's board state and or game plan to make beating up easier. I think this can be attributed to the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is different to other card games in how battling works. Aggro decks are allowed the option to stop interacting with the opponent's game plan entirely in other games.
Do me trade? Nope. Me go ferries? Yep.
In Yu-Gi-Oh! You have to interact with any monster that the opponents may have before you start beating them in. Who's the beatdown in Yu-Gi-Oh! However, would deserve its own discussion, so we'll stop here before I get myself sidetracked. Regardless, it paints a pretty clear picture of how to assign roles in card games on a fundamental level in every single game, the beatdown and the control. These labels work fine in Yu-Gi-Oh! But already we see some disconnect to other card games. Why is this? You might be aware of the answer too already. Power creep. Now, this doesn't mean that power creep is necessarily the worst in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm not implying that, nor do I believe that to be true. So it can be an entire different discussion on its own. What I want to imply is, in my opinion, power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has taken a different course to other games, in what I call horizontal power creep. Taking a page out of the idea that horizontal and vertical design in MMORPG exists, I think horizontal and vertical power creep also exists, and discussion in MMORPGs have also thrown these terms around. So, what do they mean? Vertical power creep in this case means that a card is stronger than its predecessors. Maybe the card does a specific thing better. Maybe both versions is roughly the same thing with a condition, but the condition is easy to satisfy in a new version. This feels like the more obvious and more common type of power creep because it's simpler in design choice, so that's just me saying that. And disclaimer, I don't have solid evidence of there being more vertical power creep than horizontal. Maybe someone can look into that. But I digress. Horizontal power creep increases the power cards in a subtler way by allowing the cards to do more things instead of doing one thing better. Kashtira. Yes, I have beef with this design of this archetype. How did you know? Is a good example of this. A card that searches for an archetype monster, spell, or trap is normal, and they usually have mediocre stats in return. A card that can banish in response to card effects is normal, and is probably your payoff card, so they are likely to have good stats. The Kashtira searchers get the best out of both worlds. They are both the build-up and the payoff. A Rise Heart is both a disruption and a floodgate. But this is not a discussion on why Kashtira is everything wrong with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! No. In my honest opinion, Kashtira is more of an exception than the norm. I'm just making it the punching bag because it's easier to make a point with the archetype. So, in order to look unbiased, let's do more examples. Tier Elements is also an easy exception. They mill, they fuse, and for some god-forsaken reasons, some of them have way to special summon themselves to the field too. Branded Opening is not only a searcher but also provides protection for fusion monster afterwards. Sapphira? Dragon Queen of the Voidless Voice, or Silent Forcers if you're base. A card from an upcoming or already released, depending on when I'm done with this, and potentially meta archetype is of the following: a Send to Graveyard, a Search, and a pseudo ritual spell. You get the point. So now we can finally turn back to the original question. Why does Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck classification differs from other card games? Well, I can speak from Magic the Gathering. I feel like Hearthstone is very influenced by vertical power creep. Aggro decks gets faster. Face aggro can output higher damage. Naga Demon Hunter faster scale are around turn 4, a ceiling that classic decks can almost never reach. Disruptive aggro, or tempo, is very good at scaling a game far beyond the opponent grabs now. Make Grow, while does not directly end a game on turn 4, can easily snowball the game out of proportion by that point. To put it in perspective, in classic Hearthstone, with 4 mana you can properly plop a Yeti down on curve and call it a third. Control has improved so much in terms of the card advantage they can generate and their actual ceiling. Dr. Boom, Mad Genius, and his modern upgrade, Reno Lone Ranger, is even better at controlling the board state, are both cards that allow infinite value. Prince Renathal has allowed deck building to reach 3 cards and allowed decks to have a much higher ceiling. I can go on, but I'm not sure if you, the audience, are too familiar with Hearthstone, so I'll get to the point I want to make. I think Hearthstone has polarized its deck archetypes. Aggro kills better, control prolongs better, and mid-range has smoother transition and fall-offs, or better power spike in the mid-game. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That makes classification in Hearthstone easy, as decks does their job and their job only really well. So on the contrary, horizontal power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Allow decks to do different things, since cards can do so much more in a modern game. The extra deck also contributes to this state by allowing you direct access to options to certain game states, but that also deserves to be a topic on its own. But there's our answer. It's difficult to classify things in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because a lot of cards and decks by extension have been designed to be capable of more than one thing to a certain extent. That isn't too much of a problem because when you enter a game, it's still easy to determine who's the beatdown. And that's the most important distinction you ever had to make to win. But what if we wanted to do better? What if we still want to approach the trifecta system in Yu-Gi-Oh! To either help classification go more in-depth or to help new players start from a particular playstyle? We do have a solution for that. The Axis classification system, which will be separated into a different video. Hold your tomatoes, please. We have been juggling a lot of topics throughout this video, and I want to put more focus on the next part than anything that came before. So I think it's better to split it up here, and also because the YouTube algorithm is a massive bitch, and I like to be able to have somewhat of a maintainable output. With that being said, I hope this managed to help you see the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Somewhat better and broader, and we'll try to put an end to the question of how to classify decks in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In the next video. Thank you for watching. One of these days I'll find an annoying gimmick that's not funny at all to put at the end of the video. For now you can just leave. Goodbye.